Hello, I'm Robert Walker, Professor of American Civilization at George Washington University, author of American Society, and your host on JSB's North American Panorama. Today we're here to talk to you about Georgia, one of the original 13 colonies, founded by an Englishman named James Oglethorpe. Since Oglethorpe was also very interested in prison reform, there's a rumor that Georgia was founded by convicts. Not so. Actually, Oglethorpe's plan for this colony was so attractive that his colleagues contributed generous amounts of money. The people who first came to Georgia had won a contest. They came with Oglethorpe on the good ship Anne, landed first at Charleston, and then in 1733 established at Savannah what was to become the colony and state of Georgia, important to the Old South, to the Confederacy, and to the New South. Today we'll be bringing you aspects of Georgia's past and its present, its future as in the 1996 Olympics, some of its personalities and some of its new sounds. In thinking about Georgia today, it might be well for you to remember that Georgia is the home state of Ted Turner, President Jimmy Carter, and the late Martin Luther King. JSB's North American Panorama presents Georgia.
Sometimes it gets so hot in Georgia, you can see the heat. It ripples through the fields, rises from the highways, burns the brows of the farm workers, and causes even nature's critters to yell for relief. In many ways, Georgia is what Americans think of when they think of the South, defined forever by the unrelenting sun and its brave but tragic history. The state is named for England's King George II, who gave the land to James Oglethorpe as payment for his work as a British prison reformer. Compared to the immigrants in other states, the first Georgians were fairly well educated, skilled at many trades, and a little richer than most Americans. They also had a few pretensions and very much enjoyed a gracious life, which included hard work, but a great deal of play as well. Farms and plantations were large and far apart, so when family and friends came to visit, they stayed for several weeks, and important events such as weddings, christenings, and debuts were planned around the winter holidays when everybody could get together away from the cycle of planting and harvesting the crops. Fall, winter, and spring festivities had the added advantage of cooler weather. The plantation society, or antebellum period, didn't in fact last very long, but the families who lived it were very rich. Their lives were highly social and romantic, so the era spawned a great many myths and stories, including the fabled Gone with the Wind. In the mythical land of Tara, the women were always beautiful, the men courtly. Homes were spacious and beautifully furnished, and there were hunting parties, picnics, and dances every day and every night. The reality was quite different. Only a few families actually owned plantations, and they were dependent on slave labor. Despite the legends, the antebellum era actually emerged and then faded within just a few short years.
We're in front of a restored southern plantation called Stately Oaks, originally built in 1839 at the height of the Cotton Kingdom. It might remind you of some of the southern homes described by Harriet Beecher Stowe in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Oh, thank you. More likely, it will remind you of Tara, the plantation imagined by Margaret Mitchell, who often passed by this place as she constructed her famous novel, Gone with the Wind. These homes housed planters who built a society based on soil and climate. The industry called for staple crops: rice, indigo, sugar, tobacco, and eventually cotton. The long growing season demanded hard labor in a broiling sun, labor that Europeans were not accustomed to. Hence, these planters did what a lot of people did in the 17th century. They imported African slaves. The best of the planters treated these slaves like children and saw to their every needs. The worst of them abused their helpers and deprived them of family life, education, and religion. Planters exhausted the fertile coastal soil and tried to move westward to extend their empire. This was one of the major causes of the Civil War, which in some ways began and ended in Georgia.
With the start of the Civil War, hard times followed. General William Tecumseh Sherman was determined to end the war, even if it meant destroying the entire South. His troops followed a scorched earth policy and burned nearly everything in their path from Atlanta to the sea in November 1865. Stories of Yankee atrocities are still passed down from one generation to the next among Georgia families. General Sherman is still well hated among those with long memories.
After the war, the Reconstruction forced the South to begin again economically. The planters became farmers, sometimes aided by their former slaves. Field slaves became sharecroppers or eventually migrated north to work in factories. Politically, the occupation oversaw a pure democracy, now called the Black Reconstruction, when the majority blacks in the South were elected to legislatures and conducted a government we now think was quite good. However, with the Compromise of 1876, the South began becoming commercial and industrial, but politically, home rule meant a return to segregation and the beginning of a long road that led to the goals of Martin Luther King and President Jimmy Carter.
Ironically, it was a newspaper editor, Henry Woodfin Grady, who used the power of language to articulate the deep wounds of the war and to rally Georgians to take control of their fate.
It's during the 1880s that Henry Grady, who was the editor of the Atlanta Constitution, began to promote the concept of the New South and make it into a national movement. His idea was that the South had to not only rejoin the Union politically, but rejoin it economically, that it had to contain its racial situation by instituting if you will, a benign form of segregation. His ideas were very popular, obviously, throughout the South, but he promoted this concept nationally.
Southerners can be creative when it comes to beating the heat, and it seems just right that an Atlanta pharmacist, John Pemberton, first concocted the world's most popular soft drink, Coca-Cola. Pemberton originally promoted his drink as a cure for hangovers. Pemberton brewed his first batch of Coca-Cola in a big iron pot. As a stirring paddle, he used the oar from a canoe. He was happy to sell the original rights in 1886 to another Atlanta pharmacist for about $1,700. The formula was sold again in 1919 for $25 million to the banker Robert Woodruff. The popularity of the original formula might have been because of its thirst-quenching taste and the fact that it contained real cocaine, thought at the time to be harmless. The drug was removed years later when it was shown that thousands of people had become addicted to the drink. Coke, however, continued to grow thanks to an impressive ad campaign.
Would you like it?
Oh, yes, yes, yes. Things go better with Coca-Cola. Things go better with Coke.
Coke adds up everything that makes your living nice. Coca-Cola, keep the sun. Coke of America, see what we've got. We've got the songs the world is singing. I was raised on country sunshine. Real thing like Coca-Cola. What you hoping to find? I like to teach the world to sing. Sing with me.
Today, Coca-Cola is sold in more than 160 countries and will soon be available in the countries of the former Soviet Union. Coke was good to drink, of course, but the company's most important contribution may have been that it led the way in showing other American companies how to do business in the international marketplace. One of the businessmen who would take the lesson well was a brash young fellow named Ted Turner, who may well be one of the more influential men of the 20th century. Through the cable news network, CNN, Turner has taken the Southern art of storytelling to new high-tech avenues which transcend national borders and may have persuaded the people in communist countries that there was a better way of life. Turner's early life was tragic. His father committed suicide when he was a boy, leaving behind a nearly bankrupt outdoor billboard advertising business. Turner managed to keep the business going through a series of loans. He was never afraid of being in debt, and in 1970, at the age of 31, Ted Turner bought his first television station. That station would become WTBS, the first superstation capable of broadcasting its programs all over the United States and much of the Caribbean.
This news network is going to make another option available, which hopefully will be one that's enlightening and informative as opposed to all the entertainment that we have at the present time.
CNN, which Turner began in 1980, is seen worldwide and is today considered the most reliable source of information in the world.
Our competitors in the networking business said you couldn't start a news network that was based in Atlanta. It had to be based in New York or Washington. Well, we proved them wrong.
Turner was chosen Time magazine's Man of the Year in 1992. When U.S. Secretary of State James Baker toured the former states of the Soviet Union as they were ravaged by civil wars, the most frequent question from local mayors and other officials was, how can we get CNN? With local broadcasting and newspapers disrupted or non-existent, people felt the only way they could find out what was going on was to watch a news outlet operating from Atlanta, Georgia, thousands and thousands of miles away. Another of Georgia's influential citizens was civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
Martin Luther King's legacy in Georgia and in the world is that he taught us how to resolve problems without violence. Martin Luther King came up in the wake of the Second World War. It was a time when everybody felt that the way you solved a dispute was to go to war. And he borrowed from Mahatma Gandhi in India. And we developed a method of bringing about social change without destroying either person or property. It worked. It worked in this country, but it also worked in Poland. It worked in East Germany. It worked in the Soviet Union. If the Solidarity movement had taken up arms against the Polish communists, they would have been crushed. But it was because they went to war with the weapons of the spirit that they were able to overcome.
Martin Luther King Jr. was born into a middle-class black family in January of 1929. His father, Martin Sr., was a Baptist minister. King was also trained as a minister and went to graduate school at Boston College, where he studied philosophy and theology. An idealist from the beginning, King believed that people would do the right thing, that is, give black Americans equal rights. He practiced and preached nonviolence as a way of persuading them.
The times that I think about most are the time we spent in Birmingham in 1963. And that was the period when I think we finally learned how to put together a nonviolent movement that could get the attention of the president in Washington and indeed the whole world. So that from 1961 to 1963, we had a number of little experiments. Some worked out, some didn't. But in Birmingham in '63, it all came together. And that was when President Kennedy introduced the Civil Rights Bill, which eventually passed in 1964. And that to me was sort of the high point of my life and the high point of the Civil Rights Movement. That led to Martin Luther King winning the Nobel Prize the following year.
I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. This is why right, temporarily defeated, is stronger than evil triumphant.
Disperse, you are ordered to disperse.
King went to jail more than once for his beliefs.
Well, I don't know what will happen now, but it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over. And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Martin Luther King Jr. was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee, shot in the face as he stood alone on the balcony of his hotel room.
King's leadership, his articulate speeches, and his belief in the rule of law gave him a stature and respect which no civil rights leader since has achieved.
No doubt the most famous Georgian in the world today is James Earl Carter, ex-president of the United States. Jimmy Carter began as a peanut farmer in Plains, Georgia. He rose to be governor of the state by making shrewd alliances with black leadership and promoting the idea of a progressive Georgia. Nonetheless, when he emerged on the national scene in the mid-'70s, he was a virtual unknown. It was nearly miraculous that he achieved the Democratic nomination and the presidency of the United States. Among the controversies that characterized his term in office was his penchant for making continual pronouncements on the subject of human rights. Today, this might not be considered extraordinary, but in the context of the 1970s, when human rights was considered a national province, Carter's insistence on world awareness was pioneering indeed.
But Jimmy Carter had done the right thing, and that seemed to become a guiding principle of his presidency. He worked tirelessly to achieve the Camp David Accords, which brought together Arab and Israeli leaders for the first time.
I think Jimmy Carter is driven by a desire to do what is right. And I think in part because he felt hampered as president. It's almost as though now he has all of the wisdom and knowledge of the presidency without the political constraints. He doesn't have to get the vote of a Congress to do what he wants to do. It simply takes the vision and the courage of his own convictions, and he can take on almost any challenge. And he's finding that he can take on almost any challenge and succeed.
Here, in this very pleasant glade in the midst of the city of Atlanta, the nation, the state, private contributors have built a Carter Presidential Center. It houses his library, a miniature Oval Office, and trophies of his continuing efforts on behalf of peace. It contains an office from which this distinguished ex-president conducts his campaign on behalf of children for modest housing and in the cause of universal human rights.
It's fascinating that former President Jimmy Carter, Ted Turner, and civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. were all born within a few miles of each other, a few years apart. Bold and unusual leaders often come from agricultural areas like Georgia, but they need a place to test their ideas, and that is usually a large city. Atlanta is the biggest city in the South, an imperfect and bustling urban center, though it is also a city of gracious old homes and gentle people.
Almost as soon as the fires were ended in Atlanta, began promoting itself as a city on the move, a city that would define what became the New South. I've used the terms that Atlanta defined itself by hard work, hot air, and a lot of energy. And I think that pretty much describes the city. It is a New South city. It is not the laid-back city like Savannah, our sister city on the coast. The promotion of the city, of this New South city, finally picked up the term the Atlanta spirit, a very strong civic spirit, which one continues to hear today, articulated by many of contemporary Atlantans in different terms from Henry Grady, but very much in the same spirit as Henry Grady.
The city has an unusual symmetry, which is best exemplified by the work of Atlanta architect and developer John Portman.
John Portman is symbolic of the rebirth of downtown Atlanta and much of the growth in the suburbs since the 1960s. The building we are standing on, the little porch we're standing on right now, was his first building, the Merchandise Mart. Behind us, we can see a number of his buildings. The blue bubble is the revolving restaurant of the Regency Hyatt, his first famous restaurant. The tall building to the side of that is One Peachtree Center, which is his new signature building. What Portman did was to begin building in downtown Atlanta in 1962, when there was very little building going on. He practices what one architectural critic once called the architecture of entertainment. It is, and he fits in very much with Ted Turner in the sense that it is a flamboyant kind of architecture, not the postmodern symbolic architecture, but an architecture that is geared toward people, with elevators running up and down the side of the building, things hanging, very dramatic interiors, very much that concept of the architecture of entertainment.
Atlanta was one of the first cities in North America to figure out a way to beat Mother Nature. Underground Atlanta. Shopping in underground Atlanta, which was once the actual street level, means folks never have to worry about the chill or the sultry summers. Because of its history of successful international business ventures, Atlanta is the favored city for foreign companies who need an outpost in the American South. And the city is a magnet for many well-educated young people who find Atlanta still knows the fine art of Southern hospitality. When it comes to entertainment, Georgia grows genius. A remarkable number of great musicians have come from Georgia. Musicians who are not just great as performers, but also as innovators. People who set the standard in their particular style. Why Georgia would produce such a rich legacy of talent is something of a mystery, even to Georgians themselves. But nobody has trouble enjoying the fruits of that talent. Probably the musician most associated with Georgia is Ray Charles, simply because Ray Charles performed the most famous version of the state's most famous song.
Georgia, oh Georgia, the whole day. Oh, sweet song keeps Georgia on my mind. I say, Georgia.
Ray Charles was born in Albany, Georgia in 1930, but he didn't stay long. His family moved to Florida when he was still a child. Nonetheless, some impression of his birthplace must have stuck with Charles. In 1960, his soulful version of the old pop standard, Georgia on My Mind, became his first national hit. It remains a classic today.
It's the old sweet song. Oh, keep Georgia on my mind. I think for the little girls on my mind. Hey, oh, yeah.
Another Georgia-born artist who stayed in the state longer and whose impact on music was as great was Richard Penniman, better known as Little Richard. Little Richard was born in Macon, Georgia in 1932. He became one of the most outrageous, most sexually provocative performers in the history of rock and roll.
Are you having a good time? Let it all hang out! Mom, let all the women folks say, woo! Let all the men say, oh! Oh, my son. Good golly, Miss Molly. Sure like the bone. Woo! Golly, Miss Molly. Sure like the bone. You're rocking that rolling, yeah. I get in your mama down. Woo! Golly, Miss Molly. Sure like the bone. Woo! Golly, Miss Molly. Sure like the bone. Now when you're rocking that rolling, yeah. I get in your mama down.
A flamboyant bisexual, Richard virtually invented glitter rock 20 years before David Bowie and Elton John became famous for it. Little Richard favored wild pompadour hairdos, lipstick, rouge, eyeliner, and the flashiest clothes he could find. All this in the conservative 1950s in the even more conservative South.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to the true rock and roll. The 1956 rock and roll.
Little Richard was not an overnight success in the music business. He tore up the stage in live performances, but whenever he entered a recording studio, he became strangely subdued. For years, he put out boring rhythm and blues tunes, and for years, he failed to have a hit record. His luck changed in 1955. During a break in a recording session, Little Richard and his producers stopped in a bar down the street where there happened to be a piano. Little Richard started performing an off-color song called Tutti Frutti, rolling his eyes and shouting. The producer rushed him back to the studio, where a writer was enlisted to create new, less risque lyrics for the song. Little Richard had his first million seller.
Tutti Frutti, Tutti Frutti, oh Rudy, Tutti Frutti, oh Rudy, Tutti Frutti, oh Rudy, a womp bum a loom bum a lump bum bum.
Other hits, all in the same frenetic, pounding style, soon followed, including Long Tall Sally, Rip It Up, Jenny Jenny, Good Golly Miss Molly, and Lucille.
Lucille, I want to deal so sweet. Lucille.
The urgent sexual power of Little Richard's music was a major influence on another superstar from Georgia, Otis Redding. Otis Redding became a much bigger star than Little Richard. He was probably the first soul star to win widespread acceptance among white audiences in the United States.
I've been loving you oh too long, and I don't want to stop now. Oh. 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 You do that one more time, Al, just like that. Oh. Oh.
A charismatic performer, Otis Redding became popular with black audiences on the strength of such hits as Mr. Pitiful, I've Been Loving You Too Long, and Respect.
Has been so wonderful.
Redding's breakthrough with white audiences resulted from his incandescent performance at the Monterey Pop Festival in California in 1967. He came on stage in Monterey late at night, a virtual unknown to a hippie audience sated after a long day of psychedelic rock from groups like The Who, Jefferson Airplane, and the Grateful Dead. Instantly, he had the crowd on its feet, yelling and cheering wildly. For most of the white kids there, Otis Redding was a revelation. This was what soul music was all about.
Sitting in the morning sun, I'll be sitting when the evening comes.
The passionate reception Redding received in Monterey inspired a song that he wrote soon after, Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay. It became his first #1 record. It was also his last record.
Sitting on the dock of the bay, watching the tide roll away.
On December 10th, 1967, his chartered plane crashed into a Wisconsin lake, killing Redding and 4 members of his backup band. His reputation continued to grow long after his death. Today, Otis Redding is recognized as one of soul music's greatest artists.
Nice people with a picture of a sound out of Macon, Georgia. Let's welcome, please, the Allman Brothers.
Guitarist Duane Allman and keyboardist Greg Allman formed the nucleus of the Allman Brothers. They specialized in a unique blend of rock, blues, and jazz-like improvisation. Eventually, they came to epitomize a style known as Southern rock. Southern rock is a style drenched in machismo. Lots of drugs, lots of booze, lots of motorcycles, and lots of women are its essential components. It's a hard-living style that can take a toll, as it did on the Allman Brothers. But it makes for some great hard rock and roll music. Swan, swan, hummingbird. In In the 1980s, a new wave of Georgia rock began emerging from an unlikely place, the little college town of Athens, Georgia. Athens today is not only the center of Georgia rock, it's one of the leading centers of new rock and roll groups anywhere in the world. Much of that reputation derives from the fact that Athens was home base to both REM and the B-52s. It was out of boredom that a group of students and former students who could barely play musical instruments formed the B-52s. The group was more of a joke than a band at first. They put together bright, tacky costumes from local thrift stores, and the girls wore towering wigs, teased into a bouffant style known as B-52. It was for that hairstyle, not the B-52 bomber, that the group was named.
We used to dress up and go to parties. In fact, we were like the terrors of parties. Remember that? You know how that was. We used to go to parties and friends of mine would say, "Oh, I was so afraid y'all would come to the party." Just one time I brought this hose out from outside into the house and sprayed it around inside.
We would walk in and somebody would say, "Who invited them?"
The B-52s from the beginning were a dance band dedicated to keeping the parties hopping in Athens. Their signature song, Rock Lobster, was little more than a dance riff with a nonsense chorus. What the B-52s had no way of knowing when they formed was that the whole country was in a mood for silly dance music in the early 1980s. REM takes the B-52's literate sensibility one step further. They are the quintessential college rock band. Whereas Southern rockers tend to sing of women, women, and women, REM didn't do a love song until its fifth album or so. REM sang instead about more esoteric subjects, although exactly what those subjects were was hard to tell, since the lyrics were usually indecipherable. What was clear was that REM's tunes were arty, poetic, wistful, and smart. What was more important with REM was the melody and the mood, folkish, but at the same time driving, with jangly guitars and dense textures. They had a unique style that was sophisticated yet accessible.
I'm trying to tell you something about my life.
One Georgia group supported by the members of REM is a folk duo known as the Indigo Girls. The Indigo Girls are Amy Ray and Emily Salyers, two young women from Atlanta who brought back the sort of sensitive, guitar-strumming folk songs popularized by such singers as Judy Collins, Joan Baez, and Joni Mitchell during the 1960s. They burst on the scene with their first major label album in 1988. The album quickly won a Grammy Award for Best Contemporary Folk Recording, and the Indigo Girls were among the nominees that year in the Best New Artist category. They have since won a devoted national following, especially among angst-ridden adolescent girls. People in Georgia seem to do what feels right, and that, it turns out, feels right to a lot of people outside of Georgia, too.
The International Olympic Committee has awarded the 1996 Olympic Games to the city of Atlanta.
I wasn't surprised. I really expected us to get it all along. We had been given a challenge. Now we have to do something with the Olympics in this 100th anniversary that helps the world understand what the Olympic movement stands for. And what the Olympic movement stands for is that people of differing backgrounds can compete peacefully, and that wars can cease, and that we can have a world where, through peaceful competition, we continue to get better and better.
I'm going to try to swim to the year 2000 to be in Olympics.
I want to be in the Olympics.
I'm going to make it, Phil. I'm going to make it.
Come on. Yeah, oh, that's better. Shields up. Yeah, press up.
It's still a few years away, but what's a few years when you really, really, really want to do something? That's the attitude of Atlanta attorney Billy Payne, who really wanted the Summer Olympics to come to his town in 1996.
I believed in what we were doing. I really didn't look at it as a win-lose proposition until the last 6 months. But I believe passionately in what we are doing, and that our efforts would be victorious, however you measured that.
Former United Nations ambassador and former mayor Andrew Young says by the time the games take place, Payne will have been working on the project for almost 10 years.
Billy Payne quit his job the day he decided the Olympics should come to Atlanta, and devoted a year of his time studying the Olympics and the process and trying to make sure that it was possible. And he did this full-time at his own expense. He spent all of his savings and money that he could borrow from friends. And so when he brought it to me as a mayor, he had already worked out the idea in such a way that he could convince me that we could put on the Olympics with no government funds. When he presented the idea that we could run the Olympics as a private business venture that would not require any public funds, but would leave a legacy of Olympic facilities for the public, it seemed to me that that was a win-win situation. So I got involved as mayor and said that I was willing to help.
Young says his work with Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement was good training in persuading the International Olympic delegates that Atlanta was the right city for 1996.
I had a pretty good understanding of how international politics works. And one thing I learned at the United Nations was that politics, whether it's at the local level or at the international level, is basically personal. And so we visited every single country that had an Olympic delegate, and we personally invited them to come to visit us. There was one other thing, though, and that is in 1988, that was the year that the Berlin Wall came down. It was also the year that Nelson Mandela came out of jail. The world was thinking about freedom, and freedom was happening all over the world without violence. In fact, most people, when they got free, including the children in China who were protesting in Tiananmen Square, they had "We Shall Overcome" written on their T-shirts. And "We Shall Overcome" was the song of the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King, who is a native of Atlanta. So we had the combination of the old-style Southern charm and hospitality that was represented by Gone with the Wind, and the new-style freedom and human dignity that was represented by Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. And those two things together gave us, I think, quite a combination of things that we could share with the rest of the world.
The leadership of the International Olympic Committee is changing. and a whole new approach will be instituted with the 1996 Games. To save on costs, Young says 100,000 volunteers will come from every corner of Georgia to help with the Olympics.
Let me say that from the very beginning, I have been a volunteer with the Olympics. And during the time of the 2-year period that we were competing for the Olympic Games, we only had 6 paid staff people. But we had several hundred volunteers who gave their time and their talents, sometimes used their own money to help bring the games here to Atlanta. So there's a good volunteer tradition.
Even so, the Atlanta Olympic Committee still hopes to sign up corporate sponsors willing to pay up to $40 million for the right to advertise their products and services during the Games. Some of the cash will also be used to build a $225 million Olympic stadium. As well as a convention complex called the World Congress Center. Sponsorships will be limited to 10 or 12 partners, who will also receive rights to advertise in the upcoming Olympic Games in Norway. Preliminary plans call for sponsors to have access to hotel rooms, tickets for the opening and closing ceremonies, chauffeur-driven limousines, tickets to daily events, and hospitality suites, so sponsors can wine and dine their clients. The former mayor believes Atlanta is ready to show the world how people of different races can get along with each other.
And what we want to do is let people in the world know that we have all of the differences of culture, of race, of class that any other part of the world has, and that we're able to live together in peace and with some measure of prosperity. And that if it's possible for us, it's possible for the whole world. The Olympics gives us a chance not only to demonstrate that, but to share it with the whole world. Over 4 billion people will see the Olympics on television. That's almost 80% of the world's population. And we want to be proud of what they see.
The Games will take place in several areas. The Olympic ring will be built downtown. The Olympic Park will be put up in Stone Mountain, Georgia, outside Atlanta. Equestrian competitions will take place at the Georgia International Horse Park, about 32 miles from Atlanta. Shooting events will be held at Wolf Creek Shooting Center, which is being developed near Atlanta's International Airport. Yacht races will take place in the Atlantic Ocean off the shores of one of the state's most graceful cities, Savannah, Georgia. Parks for baseball and women's softball competitions are still being developed.
The hope in Atlanta and in our present mayor, Mayor Jackson's office, is that the Olympics will not only bring in all of the money that we're looking for, but it will rebuild the city. And there's much talk now about using the Olympics to design the city of the 21st century. Many authorities anticipate that the real impact of the Olympics will begin around 1997 and carry into the 21st century. So some of the sites and venues that are being planned for the Olympics are being planned in a long-term sense. For example, the Olympic Village, which will be near Georgia Tech, will be student housing after the Olympics. So there is the hope that the building of the Olympics will have a long-term impact on the development of Atlanta, certainly well into the next century.
We hope you've enjoyed this visit to the Old South and the New South, to the exciting city of Atlanta with its plans for Olympics in 1996 and its hopes to become the city of the 21st century. JSB, North American Panorama, has brought you Georgia.